Thanks to everybody for coming. My name is Chris Roy. I'm one of about a half a dozen trustees of the Euclid Heights Historical Society, and we'd like to welcome you all here this evening. Obviously, our reason for being here is to celebrate homicides of approximately 100 years ago. And it occurred to me as we went through the process of inviting John Stark Bellamy to join us tonight that there's a little bit of irony that tends to be attached to our recollection of heinous crimes, in that the farther back you go, the more romance we tend to attach to even the most vicious, horrible events. Whereas if John were here tonight talking about a murder that had taken place in 1985, first of all, very few people here would have either have shown up, but the majority of us would have thought it to be kind of crude or uncomfortable. But the farther back in history we go, the more romance we tend to attach to a whole variety of occurrences that in more recent times would just be considered despicable or, to say the very least, unpleasant. So with that, I'd like to introduce you all to John Stark Bellamy, who, as some of you will know, is a freelance writer as well as a history specialist for the Cuyahoga County Library. He's also a lifelong Clevelander. Who, as it says on my crib notes here, grew up hearing about Cleveland crimes and disasters from his grandfather Paul, who was editor of the Plain Dealer, and his father Peter, who wrote for the Cleveland News and the Plain Dealer. John is best known locally for 3 books that chronicle Cleveland area murders and disasters that have taken place over roughly the last 1.5 centuries, including They Died Crawling and Other Tales of Cleveland Woe, published in 1995, The Maniac in the Bushes and More Tales of Cleveland Woe, published in 1997, and The Corpse in the Cellar and Further Tales of Cleveland Woe, published in 1999. We're averaging, looks like, about 1 every 2 years, so where is 2001?
Actually, last year we did publish a 4th book called The Killer in the Attic and Even More Tales of Cleveland.
Well, then you need to update your website.
It's not my website.
Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, you're right. It's
the publisher's website.
Okay, all right. I take it back then. I should know better than to admonish a speaker. In any event, the crib notes also say that last but not least, Mr. Bellamy is a prolific book reviewer who lists his interests as reading, reading, and reading. We all appreciate such diversity. So once again, thanks to Mr. Bellamy for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Cleveland Heights. This is actually, believe it or not, my first appearance here. About 13 years ago, I decided to become rich and famous in Cleveland as I was approaching what Macbeth so aptly calls the sear, the yellow leaf of middle age. And I wanted to do it with as least effort as possible. So I thought, well, what should I do? I thought, well, I could exploit my morbid interest in murders and disasters that I've been accumulating material for all my life. So I thought, all I have to do is write up a couple of accounts, send them off to local Cleveland periodicals, and in 6 months, the royalty checks will be flown in, I'll be beating rupees off with a stick, and the only things that I'll have to worry about for the rest of my life is counting my money and the size of my prostate gland. Well, I sent them off and they rejected me and sent them back, said, not suitable for our present needs, blah, blah, blah. I thought, what am I going to do now? Too lazy to really work for fame and riches. So I thought, well, I could do slideshows about murders and disasters. I know other people have done things like that. Mind you, I didn't own a camera. I didn't know how to take pictures. I certainly didn't know how to put together a slideshow. But armed with inexhaustible reservoirs of incompetence and ignorance, I plowed into it anyway, and an embarrassing number of thousands of dollars later, I started doing slideshows around the Cleveland area on Cleveland murders and disasters in 1994. First murder show I ever did, in fact, was the one you were about to see, about the murder of William Lowe in 1910. In 1995, I finally cobbled together enough stories to publish my first book. They Died Crawling in 1997, The Maniac in the Bushes. In 1999, The Corpse in the Cellar, and as we just noted, The Killer in the Attic, and More True Tales of Cleveland Woe last year, making a total of 4 books and 83 tales of what I like to refer to as the cream of Cleveland dysmalia. I also have, for those who are interested in public executions, a book that's available only on the internet over at the Cleveland Digital Library of Cleveland State University. It's called By the Neck Until Dead, A History of Hangings in Cuyahoga County, of which there were 9 in the 19th century. And suffice it to say that my accounts leave nothing to the imagination. And without further ado, except to say that I'm happy to say that all of the character traits that made me as a pariah and a social misfit growing up and going to school in Cleveland Heights have since paid off in spades for me. And it's a great pleasure to be here. 1910, if you'll remember, was a good time to be rich. There was no income tax, and even the federal income tax that came 3 years later remained at a very low rate until World War II. There was no inflation to speak of, prices were low, and they wouldn't be going up until the First World War. The advertisements in the Plain Dealer, for example, in August of 1910, reflected the cheapness of things for people with money. The George H. Bowman Company was selling a 26-piece case of guaranteed silverware for only $5. The G.L. Shriver Company was advertising Oxford or pump shoes at $3.85 the pair. And the S. Baum Company at 8th and Superior was selling all of its Hart Schaffner and Mark summer and spring suits for $17.50 apiece, with the shirts thrown in for 70 cents. The ever-tasteful Halley Brothers was offering a Russian pony coat lined with satin and 52 inches long for a mere $49, and a round-trip boat excursion ticket to Cedar Point cost only $1. The Vincent Barstow Company at 7th and Euclid was selling bird's eye maple dressers at $38. And the predecessors of what would become the Van Swearingen Company that exploited Shaker Heights were actually boasting in their ads that their new suburban development was inaccessible to rail transit. Sure, there were problems for most people. Most Clevelanders, especially those living in its teeming, overcrowded immigrant slums, had incomes so small that the items I've mentioned were rare or even impossible luxuries to them. Too many of them lived in shanties like these tenements in the flats. Too many of their children had to play in streets like this one. And too many of their parents had to work in sweatshops like this one. The News and the Plain Dealer, the Cleveland News, the Cleveland Leader, and the Cleveland Press also chronicled darker realities. Cholera was killing thousands in Tsarist Russia, and a congressional investigation in Washington was exposing peonage in the company coal towns of western Pennsylvania. Dr. Crippen and his young paramour had just been captured and apprehended for the poisoning of his wife. And good old John D. Rockefeller was about to be arrested by an alert Constable Bilkey of South Euclid for the crime of speeding his automobile at 30 miles an hour in a 20-mile-an-hour zone. There was a horrifying story out of Palestine, Texas, where a mob of 200 to 300 white men had just hunted down and butchered 20 unarmed black men in the streets because of an argument over a personal debt. But still, if you were rich, it could be a comfortable, pleasant, smiling world. And if you were William Lowe Rice, prominent Cleveland attorney, clubman, horseman, and socialite, rich, male, white, and oozing power, it must have been very nice indeed. This is the story of how 47-year-old William Lowe Rice went from the pinnacle of a powerful, envied life to a sudden, scandalous, excruciating death in just a few seconds of violence on Euclid Heights Boulevard one warm summer August night in 1910. Until that fateful August night, William Lowe Rice was one of the most amazing success stories of late 19th and early 20th century Cleveland. Born in 1863, the son of John V. Rice, a respectable Pennsylvania attorney, William Lowe Rice attended Pennsylvania Military Academy in Chester, which had been founded by his family. Trained as a civil engineer, William nevertheless decided in 1883, while on a visit to his friend Fred Fox in Norwalk, Ohio, to follow the law. So after studying with Fred's father, probate judge Daniel Fox, William Lowe Rice passed the bar and came to Cleveland to seek his fortune. It wasn't long in coming. William Lowe Rice was a man on the make from the beginning, and bustling, ever-growing Cleveland was a city likewise on the make, with much to reward a young man of talent and ambition. Starting at a $6 a week clerking job in the law firm of Adams and Russell, Rice rose to become Russell's law partner in just 4 years. When that partnership ended in the early 1890s, Rice joined in creating a new law firm, the legal powerhouse of Blandon and Rice. E.J. Blandon was a former judge of the Cuyahoga Court of Common Pleas, and Rice had argued his first case in Cleveland before him. Frank Ginn, another successful Cleveland lawyer who had read law under Judge Blandon, would join to make it Blandon, Rice, and Ginn in 1898, and that firm would eventually evolve over the next century into the firm today we call Jones Day, Ravis, and Polk. Now, just what kind of a lawyer was William Lowe Rice? Well, his potted, and I suspect paid for, biography in the 1892 Cleveland Press Souvenir edition soothingly assured its readers that William Lowe Rice was, quote, recognized as a lawyer of ability and by his clients is considered a safe and reliable advisor. His clientage is of a most substantial and remunerative character. Rice's obituaries made it clear, however, that his success did not come in the courtroom, and indeed, that Rice had from an early point in his career eschewed trial work to concentrate on business and financial matters. Just what were those matters? Well, William Lowe Rice was a legal pioneer in the art, shall we say, of adjusting the affairs of businesses that are in trouble, usually very desperate trouble. When Captain Levi Schofield's new building at 9th and Euclid developed financing problems in the early 1900s, William Lowe Rice was able to readjust those finances, put the enterprise on a paying basis, and return it to Mr. Schofield for a very substantial fee, of course. During the solid days of his subsequent career, Rice became a local legal legend for his almost uncanny ability to save such foundering enterprises. Ultimately, in the months before his death in 1910, Rice would attempt to conduct another financial rescue operation, this time on the new, architecturally innovative, John Hartness Brown building on Euclid. This is a portrait of its developer, John Hartness Brown. Only this time, William Lowe Rice would somehow end up with a controlling interest in the Brown building. There are those who think that his maneuvers in this affair cost him his life, but more of that later. Suffice it to say that by the early 1900s, William Lowe Rice was one of the most successful lawyer, entrepreneur, developers in Cleveland. Cleveland Heights itself, then an ultra-ritzy housing development for the most part, for the wealthy, known mainly as Euclid Heights, had been developed originally by Rice, Patrick Calhoun, whose original house in Cleveland Heights I see is for sale now on Edgehill, and John Hartness Brown in the mid-1890s. But by 1910, both Patrick Calhoun and John Hartness Brown were in financial trouble, and guess who by now was the president of the multi-million-dollar-plus Euclid Heights Realty Company that owned most of the real estate west of Coventry and north of Cedar? William Lowe Rice, that's who, and he also had an interest in Calhoun's Euclid Heights Company. Let's take a look at some views of the exclusive gentry suburb that Rice, Calhoun, and Brown developed. This is the top of Cedar Hill at Euclid Heights, as it looked in the mid-1890s. This is the same intersection, looking north towards Overlook Road. The Howard Eels estate is prominent on the right side. This is the same intersection, about 1890, looking in the opposite direction towards Harcourt Drive. And this, to give you an idea of just how rural Cleveland Heights was even as late as 1910, is Lee Road, looking south toward Shaker Heights, where Beaumont is right now. Rice was a member of the syndicate that bought the Shaker properties from the Buffalo Land Company for the development that eventually produced Shaker Heights. He was also involved with his friend Jerome Zerby, who lived over on Harcourt Drive, in coal mining and distributing operations worth millions. In addition, William Lowe Rice was a director of 13 corporations and was reputed to be worth anywhere from $500,000 to $4 million. He was 5'8.5", an athletic 140 pounds, with blue eyes, brown hair, a brown mustache, and what were said to be good teeth. Professionally and financially, William Lowe Rice was sitting on top of the world. As it happened, he literally was sitting on the top of the world at Cleveland Heights. During his early Cleveland years, Rice and his family lived in this house at 67th and Euclid, originally built for L.A. Sackett in 1852. In the early 1890s, Rice moved into the former David Z. Norton residence at 75 and Euclid, then a fashionable, virtually suburban neighborhood. Oddly enough, Rice's law partner, Judge Blandon, eventually lived in this same house sometime after Rice, and even more oddly, David Norton's daughter, Miriam Norton White, would one day live in William Lowe Rice's last house. In any case, by the mid-1890s, Rice's quick financial success allowed him still more lofty residentials, and they were handsomely fulfilled in 1895 when he built a spectacular 12-pillared colonial brick mansion called Lowe Ridge at the center and summit of Overlook Road, high atop Cleveland's Little Italy, in a location which offered probably the most vast and impressive view of Cleveland ever available to a private resident. The house and grounds were reputed to be worth at least $200,000. Those are 1910 dollars, by the way, at the time of his death. Let's take a tour of the house and grounds. This is the first floor staircase as you come in. This is another view of the library. Here's another view of that staircase from the side. These are the staircases going from the second floor up to the ballroom. This is a comfortable looking sitting room. And now let us go into the garden. This was Rice's Italian garden, famous throughout the United States, at least among the knowledgeable and wealthy gardeners. As they used to say, what God would do if he only had the money. At the time William Lowe Rice built his estate in 1895, there were only a few houses west of his on Overlook, or the Overlook, as it was then called. Next to Low Ridge was something called the Uplands, the estate of his brother-in-law, Alfred Hoyt Granger, an architect who had designed many of the Overlook Road homes and who probably designed the layout of the neighborhood. This is an 1890s photograph of Overlook Road with a Rice house on the left. Let's go back there. On the left, and Granger's mansion on the right. This is a view of the Granger house today, now occupied by the United Cerebral Palsy Foundation, although I believe it's being sold now and redeveloped as a private residence as of now. Next to the Granger house on the west was this impressive pile, then occupied by David C. Chandler, and now owned by the Catherine Horseman Society. Across the street and to the north sat the imposing home of mining millionaire Hal Hines, a space today occupied by the First Christian Science Church. Next to the Hines mansion came the John Sherwin home, that's the church of course, later used by the Ursuline College and torn down about 30 years ago. In this turn of the century photo, you can see the Hines residence on the left. The Rice home would be up the street just around the bend on the right. But moving back down Overlook to the top of Cedar Hill would bring you to the Howard Eales mansion on the corner, possibly the grandest pile erected in this gentrified development. This is a banquet room there. And this is another view from the top of Cedar Hill. This map gives you an idea of the scope and shape of the size of the Euclid Heights development that Rice and his colleagues had created. It is obvious now what they had in mind, a recreation of Euclid Avenue's Millionaire's Row on the Heights. And I would be remiss if I did not show you the nearby Harry Colby mansion, built in 1898, and later destined to be the house I grew up in and where my mother lives to this day, and where I wrote this slideshow in my first book, They Died Crawling. This picture was taken in 1900, shortly after it was built. Colby eventually, this was his first trophy house, he eventually built what is now the Wycliffe City Hall. To the east of Rice's mansion, the nearest house, perhaps 300 yards away, was an impressive sandstone Gothic mansion belonging to, of all people, John Hartness Brown. In keeping with the spirit of the small social world we're looking at, Brown had, it seems, purchased his property from Frank Ginn, Rice's law partner. Virtually everyone within shouting, or shall we say shooting distance, was a millionaire. This is a view of Overlook Road from the Brown porch. As you can see, there are not too many trees there. Dr. Worthy Streeter, who had owned most of the Heights property before he sold it to Patrick Calhoun's syndicate, had cut down most of the trees and sold them for railroad ties, apparently. This view was photographed right through the porch, which is, of course, now enclosed. As you can see in this picture, I'm sure you're familiar with this residence at the top of Edgell and Overlook Roads. And these are two views of Overlook in 1895, with Rice's home off to the left. And this a little closer view. Can't even see those condos they built since then. By 1910, William Lowe Rice had climbed financially and socially about as high as a $6 a week clerk could have ever dared to dream. One wonders if, like Richard Corey, William Lowe Rice glittered when he walked. He was worth millions and controlled many more millions that were not his own. He possessed a magnificent estate with a fabulous sunken garden, landscaped with highly cultivated and exotic shrubbery, on a lot running 700 feet deep from Overlook Road all the way south to Euclid Heights Boulevard. He had 7 servants, a stable full of magnificent horses, a beautiful society wife, and 4 daughters membership in the Union Club, the University Club, the Cleveland Yacht Club, and the Euclid Golf Club, and a well-deserved and cultivated reputation as a high-powered lawyer, clubman, horseman, and man about town. In addition to his regular club memberships, Rice was also a leading spirit and officer in the formation activities of the famous Four in Hand and Tandem Club, an elite turn-of-the-century group of Cleveland's most socially prominent and active horsemen. And the club's many activities and outings were well publicized in the fawning society pages of turn-of-the-century Cleveland. There's not a man on that porch who's not a millionaire. And this is a photograph of Rice and his wife and their guests on some turn-of-the-century outing. A frequent guest in his carriage, oddly enough, was Cleveland Mayor Tom Johnson. And this four-in-hand horse parade took place, I believe, about 1902 or 3. And here we can see Rice in a tandem driving past the Mather Mansion on Euclid, which is still there, of course. Rice's own stables, in particular, were celebrated for the excellent caliber of his horses and the care and style that were lavished on their breeding, upkeep, and equipage. For the record, William Lowe Rice in his horsey period had 10 horses in the stables behind the house, and their names were Valentine, Victory, Vogue, Victoria, Viking, Voltaire, Vixen, Drummer Boy, Ragtime, and Black Beauty. By 1910, however, he had slimmed down to a mere 4 horses and a pony, the result of the nascent automobile age that had killed even the Four-in-Hand and Tandem Club by 1908. Here's a photo of Rice and his daughter Mildred during his driving the horse Drummer Boy. Rice's family, at the time of his death, included his wife Elise, age 38, whom he'd married in 1888, and their 4 daughters, Mildred 18, Elise 14, Virginia 11, and Helen. This is a photograph of daughter Mildred Rice at the age of 8, which would be about 1900. Those were the days, of course, when millionaires loved having pictures of their children in the newspaper so everybody could see how rich they were. Nowadays, for security reasons, they'd think twice about that. There were also as many as a dozen servants in the house during Rice's last years, although there were only 5 listed in the 1910 federal census. This was about the average number of servants in the posh overlooked neighborhood, where Rice's retainers ranged from the mere 2 servants employed by John Hartness Brown to the 8 servants who lived in the residence of Howard Eales at the corner of Euclid Heights and Overlook. Typically, William Lowe Rice had 3 men to take care of his handsome stables, 2 laundresses, a chauffeur, about a half-dozen housemaids, and the odd governess or 2 thrown in. Of his personal life, we know tantalizingly little, really nothing. We know that William Lowe Rice had an aggressive personality, and he was known widely and generally as a man who was used to getting his own way. In the aftermath of his murder, his family, of course, uttered nothing but the expected and inflated pieties about his character. But as the saying goes, no man is a hero to his valet, and a number of stories have survived that suggest that Rice had a reputation as a very hard man with a dollar, especially when it came to dealing with servants or anybody else who had to deal with him as a relative inferior. It's interesting, for example, that one Pasquale Giuliano, who was one of the first suspects browbeaten by the authorities after Rice's murder. Pasquale was a golf caddy who had caddied for Rice at the Euclid Golf Club, and suspicion swirled nastily around various other employees of the club, who it seems to have been generally assumed might well have had a grievance against William Lowe Rice. John Grimes, Rice's coachman, testified at Rice's inquest that one of Rice's former servants had complained that Rice had cheated him out of several days' pay. Grimes also testified that another employee named Smith had exchanged hard words with Rice over a $3 fine Rice had levied on him for damaging the lawnmower. My favorite innuendo in this vein, however, was the tale gratuitously offered by Rice's gardener, Thomas Capstock, at Rice's inquest, to the effect that coachman John Grimes, again, had once been so angry and probably drunk at Mrs. Rice that he had told her that she was no lady and that he, Grimes, had coached for a damn sight better people than she ever was. And, further, one assumes that Grimes must have really been drunk, that if Mr. Rice had anything to say about it to Grimes, then that damned little son of a bitch wouldn't leave the house alive again. Grimes' story petered out with the explanation that he'd subsequently made sincere and contrite apology to Mrs. Rice and to Mr. Rice. But why was William Lowe Rice sleeping with 2 loaded revolvers underneath his bedding during the week before he was killed? Maybe the last word on Rice's manner with the help belongs to Albert Stanley, who was briefly employed by Rice as a coachman at the turn of the century. In 1959, almost 50 years after Rice's murder, Stanley recalled an argument with Rice in which Rice had ended the dispute over an $8 debt by shouting that Stanley would be gray, before he ever got money out of William Lowe Rice. But I digress. Before we proceed to the bloodletting, let me give you a glimpse of life as it was graciously lived in the palatial Rice Mansion during his golden years. The text is from the June 8, 1901 edition of Cleveland Town Topics, the glossy outlet for turn-of-the-century Cleveland Society news. This is the Rice portrait, of course. On Wednesday, Mrs. William Lowe Rice was the hostess at a very fashionable luncheon of 24 covers given in honor of Mrs. Albert Johnson of New York. The 3 tables were set in the handsome dining room of the Rice residence on Euclid Heights, and each held a large white hat tied with white satin ribbons and filled to overflowing with cornflowers and maidenhair ferns. Corsage bouquets of the flowers were given to each guest. The house was decorated throughout with spring blossoms, and there was harp and violin music. This view of the porch is probably as it looked on that famous day that Mrs. Albert Johnson came to die. She, of course, was the wife of Albert's brother, Tom. Or she was Albert's brother, who was the brother of Tom Johnson, the mayor of Cleveland. And so now it is time for William Lowe Rice to die. On Thursday night, August 4th, Rice returned to his home about 10 p.m., where he had a brief conversation with his gardener, Thomas Capstock. The next morning, Rice rose at 10 minutes after 8 and was driven downtown to his law office in the Schofield building by John Grimes. Rice was relatively alone at Low Ridge, as his family had been gone since early July for their regular summer vacation at Weona, Massachusetts, where Rice was planning to join them soon. After a day of business, Rice left work and arrived at the Euclid Golf Club at 4:30 and was out on the links with the club pro, Harry Reese. Let's leave William Lowe Rice for a moment in the warm evening summer sun of August 1910 and look at the sitting for his impending butchery. The Euclid Golf Club and its links are only words now, but at that time they occupied a great deal of the northern part of the Euclid Heights allotment of Cleveland Heights Village. The back 9 holes took up most of the wedge that runs east of the junction of Fairmount Boulevard and Cedar, and had been donated to the club in 1900 by John D. Rockefeller, with the proviso that no golf be played on his land on the Sabbath. The front 9 holes occupy the area west and south of Norfolk Road, running down towards the top of Cedar Glen, with the magnificent Tudor clubhouse itself occupying grounds near the current southeast corner of Norfolk and Derbyshire roads. This photograph, in fact, shows the ceremonious arrival of the 4-in-hand club at the Euclid Golf Clubhouse. A convenient path from the front of this clubhouse led north through the links towards Euclid Heights Boulevard, where club members could catch streetcars east and westbound that ran only 12 minutes apart, even as late as 10:30 p.m. Eat your heart out. William Lowe Rice, an avid golfer, was a frequent visitor at the Euclid Golf Club, and he sometimes walked home from there late in the evening to the back entrance of his property on Euclid Heights Boulevard, now the front entrance of the Margaret Wagner home. Rice played golf that evening until sunset. He was happy with the shape of his playing, and he bragged moderately about it to his fellow club members. He then took a shower, followed by dinner with W.H. Burgess of the United Mine Company and his friend and business partner, Jerome Zerby. Burgess later said that Rice talked cheerfully, and everyone who saw him at the club that night testified that he was in the best of spirits. It was also said that Rice briefly watched a bridge game in progress and then retired to a private room to write some letters. We shall never know what was in those letters. For all of its repute as a sleepy hamlet inhabited chiefly by quiet millionaires, it would seem that the western end of Cleveland Heights was seething with strange people that warm summer night. Let me catalog some of the mysterious goings-on in that vicinity as Rice prepared to leave the club at about 10:30 p.m. Around 10:25 to 10:35, there was a power blackout on the Heights that night. Although officials of the power company later claimed that the western area of Cleveland Heights was not affected, the conductor of the Euclid Heights streetcar testified that the streetlight was out when he passed the top of Cedar Hill at 10:09 p.m. About 10:30, just before Rice went out the club's front door, John C. Chandler, a sales agent for the Lackawanna Steel Company who lived at the club, saw 2 men, small of stature and roughly dressed, walking up Euclid Heights Boulevard just east of Derbyshire. As he heard their footsteps gaining on him, Chandler suddenly wheeled and confronted them, upon which they crossed the street to avoid him, and he continued on his way to the clubhouse. A couple of minutes later, well-known attorney Rufus Ranney, alighting from a streetcar at the top of Cedar Hill, saw what he thought were 2 suspicious-looking men sitting on a bulldozer parked on the boulevard, who subsequently matched the description of the 2 men that Chandler saw. At the same time, a man alighted from the same or another streetcar at the overlook Euclid Heights intersection and met another man on the corner whom he engaged in conversation. Meanwhile, M.A. Wood, a motorist driving down Harcourt toward the top of Cedar Hill, noticed an odd couple on the street. The man, solidly built, had a mustache, and the woman wore a shawl over her head. Wood, whose headlight had gone out, asked the man for a match, but the man merely muttered, "Me no got no match," and continued on with his female companion. And Thomas Capstock, Rice's Chatty Gardner, would later testify that he thought there might have been a man and a woman trespassing on the rice ground sometimes that same evening, but he was rather vague on the details and the exact time. Someone named Robert Allen also added his 2 cents to the effect that he had seen 2 foreigners on the north side of Euclid Heights at that time of night and that they had smooth, dirty faces. At 10:30, William Lowe Rice said goodbye to Grover Higgins, a club member, at the door and walked out into the night. He took the path that led south across the links towards Euclid Heights Boulevard. On that path, he met John C. Chandler. They exchanged greetings, and Rice continued on his way. It was the last time he was seen alive. No one knows whether Rice stayed on the path all the way to Euclid Heights Boulevard or whether he cut more diagonally southwest across the slope of the golf course towards the intersection at Derbyshire and Euclid Heights. Sometimes he walked home from the club, it is true, but he always seemed to have himself driven from his home to the club, a habit some found peculiar in a man who prided himself on physical fitness and who reputedly frequently went to the club for exercise. John Gunther, who lived at the corner of Grandview and Cedar, where the Firestone Tire Store is today, would later opine that Rice's habit of rarely traveling without at least 2 servants suggested that he had reason to fear for his personal safety. We know that William Lowe Rice got at least as far as Derbyshire and Euclid Heights, at a point in the street just in front of where the red door of the English church is now. It was then a vacant lot. It was only several hundred feet from the back entrance to his estate from there, but the empty corner lot was covered with trees and shrubbery. And it seems an inescapable fact that someone or one or more persons came out of that thicketed field towards William Lowe Rice just as he reached the corner at about 10:40 p.m. This is probably what it looked like then, and this is what it looks like today. In the morning after William Lowe Rice was found, it looked like that. Around 10:43 p.m., a number of people heard strange goings-on in the neighborhood of Derbyshire and Euclid Heights. William Webb, a gardener at the Eels estate at the top of Cedar Hill, heard, he thought, at least 2, perhaps 3 gunshots and a cry of distress. Across the road from Webb, William McKenzie, a chauffeur for George Chandler, was awakened by shots but went back to sleep. Charles Stanley, former city golf champion, who lived with his wife in this vicinity, heard 2 gunshots so loud that he thought someone was shooting on his property. That means business, he told his wife. Rebecca Hogsett of Kenilworth Road, whose husband, strangely enough, would later replace Rice in the firm of Blandon and Ginn, also heard shots, and then the footsteps of unknown persons running down Derbyshire towards Kenilworth or Overlook. This alley, today known as Kenilworth Lane, may be the path that his escaping assailants took. Michael Brown, a coachman for Howell Hines, who slept in a coach house next to the lane, also heard shots and later testified that he saw a neatly attired man wearing a straw hat running by the servants' quarters where Brown was sleeping. At least 3 other persons heard gunshots in the house that night. Police would later report that almost everyone living within a quarter mile of the killing told them that they heard shots, but we only have time to deal with 3 of them. The first was Clarence Jones, the conductor on a streetcar westbound on the Heights line that left Lee Road at 10:36 p.m. About 7 minutes later, he thought he heard several shots in the direction of Mornington or Coventry. About the same time, patrolman C.L. Wall of Cleveland Heights Village, who was really just a private policeman employed directly by local residents to keep an eye on their houses, was in the Mornington Edge Hill area checking on some houses when he heard shots coming from the west. Wall immediately ran down to Euclid Heights Boulevard and hopped on Jones's streetcar, discussed the gunfire with the conductor briefly, and jumped off by the path that led to the Euclid Golf Club. He ran towards the club to see what was the matter. Things were jumping at the club, too. Earl Davis, a student earning money at the club as a bellboy, was out on the porch when he heard 2 shots, followed, he thought, by 2 more reports, perhaps echoes. As he turned to go into the club, he suddenly heard the sound of footsteps running on the west side of the club toward the boulevard. Catching sight of Patrolman Wall, he alerted him to the running man, and Patrolman Wall took off in pursuit of the apparent fugitive. He caught up with his quarry, a short, stocky black man, just before they reached the club's streetcar stop at Euclid Heights. The man, apparently unconcerned, said, "You're a pretty good runner, officer." Wall scrutinized the man to see if he seemed frightened or out of breath, but as he was apparently neither, and since Patrolman Wall had no suspicion yet of an actual crime committed, he merely boarded another streetcar with a black man and took it west to Derbyshire. What he found there when he got there wasn't pretty. The streetcar Wall had previously taken to the Euclid Golf Stop had gone on its way, and it was only minutes later that its conductor, Jones, thought he saw a body lying in the street on the north side of the road. He mentioned it to his motorman, who dismissed the idea as a shadow, and the streetcar continued on down to Cedar Hill. At about the same time, Edge Hill resident Harry New and his chauffeur drove past the body going east, but apparently didn't see it. Several more minutes went by. At some time after 10:50, but before 11 p.m., a Dr. W.H. Phillips, an ophthalmologist, and his wife had been entertaining another couple at their home on Caldwell Avenue just east of Coventry. The couple was named Dr. and Mrs. T.H. George, and about 11, the four of them piled into the Phillips car so that Dr. Phillips could return the Georges to their home down in the city. Just east of Derbyshire on Euclid Heights Boulevard, they saw an automobile apparently stalled with 4 women in it and a young man attempting to restart it. Several hundred feet later, they encountered something more distressing. It was probably Dr. George who saw the body first, and Dr. Phillips brought the auto to a sudden stop only 50 feet or so beyond the body. Both doctors got out and ran back to find the bloody body of William Lowe Rice. When they found him, he was bleeding from the nose, mouth, and from an apparent wound above the right eye. His clothes were slashed at both sleeves, and the ground around him was saturated with blood. Doctors Phillips and George initially assumed that this unknown stranger was the victim of an automobile accident, perhaps hit by the stalled car that they had just passed. But as they were examining the still breathing but dying Rice, the young man from the stalled car came up and introduced himself as Frank Jardine. Jardine, it seems, had turned left on Euclid Heights in Derbyshire a minute previously and stalled out in attempting to turn his auto back towards the body that he had seen in the street. At this point, Patrolman Wall got off his second streetcar ride of the night and accosted the group. As he was talking to them, Robert Jardine left, and yet another neighborhood resident, Mr. William Royce, drove up and asked if he could help. As it was clear that Rice was in critical condition, the doctors decided to take him to a hospital and have Royce drive the doctors' wives' homes. Wall left the group to report the apparent crime, and Royce drove off with the women towards Cleveland. It was by now perhaps 11:20, and just as Dr. Phillips and George had hoisted Rice's body into the back of Phillips' touring car, who should get off an eastbound streetcar and join the group? Why, none other than John Hartness Brown, nearby neighbor of Rice's and a man with a reputed grievance against him. Testimony at the ensuing inquest revealed that while John Hartness Brown asked at the time what had happened and whether he could be of help, he did not ask who the injured man was or indicate that he had any idea that it was his ex-attorney, William Lowe Rice, who lay barely breathing in the back of Dr. Phillips' open touring car. Doctors Phillips and George drove to the Canfield Hospital, a private hospital, only to find it full, so they drove to St. Luke's, which was then on Carnegie Avenue. By the time they got there, Rice was dead, and they now decided to take him to Kobler's morgue on East 55th. Examination of the corpse there soon confirmed in detail what had been apparent at the time Rice's body had been put in the car. William Lowe Rice had been shot twice in the face with a .32 caliber weapon. One bullet had glanced off his head, leaving a superficial wound, but the other had smashed into his skull just over the right eye, crushing the orbital chamber, collapsing the eyeball, shattering the bones at the base of the skull, and burying itself in the occipital brain lobe. Rice's left palm had been slashed to the bone, probably with a knife or razor, which had also slashed his right sleeve several times without inflicting injury. Hemorrhaging in the brain indicated that Rice had also been bludgeoned with something like a blackjack, an injury that may have knocked him unconscious before his other wounds brought death. The condition of the body suggested to everyone who knew Rice that the athletic lawyer, who was a trained boxer, had put up one hell of a fight before he went down in the street. This grisly sketch is based on an actual reenactment of the murder rehearsed in the county morgue several days after Rice's killing. Rice's good friend Jerome Zerby was his stand-in for this grotesque ritual. Found near Rice's body was his open, bloody 2-inch penknife with which he had apparently waged his last unequal struggle. As you might guess, all hell broke loose in the Euclid Heights Boulevard neighborhood during the next several weeks. These 3 newspaper advertisements ran for several days, appealing to the public to come forward with information. Before the excitement was over, at least $10,000 reward money for information about the slaying was offered, and several dozen suspects hunted, hassled, and hounded by often competing and overlapping factions of police and private detectives. Theories by the score were put forward, and gossip nurtured 1,001 lurid and inconsistent theories as to how and why William Lowe Rice had been bludgeoned, shot, and stabbed to death within several hundred feet of his home. Armies of police and reporters struggled then and periodically for some years later to come up with a plausible explanation for Rice's atrocious assassination. But I must tell you tonight that we're no closer now to the truth than they were then in unraveling the reality of Cleveland's most puzzling murder. But the lingering possibilities, theories, and loose ends are entertaining, and I will give you the cream of that crop. William Lowe Rice was mourned and buried pretty quickly. His wife Elise, vacationing at Weona, Massachusetts, fainted when informed of the tragedy, but rallied soon after and returned to Cleveland with her daughters on Sunday. This Cleveland Press sketch records the scene as Mrs. Rice and the Rice daughters and servants disembarked from the train at the east of 105th Street station. Interestingly, the Rice family was accompanied back to Cleveland by a certain William Nelson Cromwell. Cromwell had been mixed up in a lot of Rice's business affairs, and most particularly in the takeover of the John Hartness Brown building. In many ways, in fact, William Cromwell was an even more successful version of William Lowe Rice, and Rice had probably learned a lot from the cunning, secretive Cromwell. Cromwell was the true pioneering specialist in restoring stick business concerns to health for handsome fees, and we can only guess at the combination of personal and professional motives that brought Cromwell back to Cleveland to comfort Rice's family and probate his late partner's estate. It is worth remarking that William Cromwell deserves the credit for selling the United States Senate on the merits of the Panama Canal scheme in 1904, and he was reputed at that time to have purloined a goodly share of the millions he was entrusted with to buy off the French claims to the canal project. In any case, William Lowe Rice's will, drawn up in 1894, before most of his children were born, left the entirety of his estate of unspecified character or value to his wife Elise, who managed to delay the completion of probate until 1922. Perhaps this was due to the cunning of Rice's law partner, E.J. Blandon, whose investment and probate advice her husband's will exhorted her to follow. Her own estate, after her death in 1938, was said to have only been about $500,000. Rice's funeral, by the way, was a very popular event. Hundreds crowded the Rice home for it, many of them being policemen who thronged there in the quaint but persistent belief that the murderer will always return to the scene of the crime. For all of their activity, alarms, and excursions, it is apparent now that the local police had no idea how to solve this crime from beginning to end. The only law officer who spoke with candor about it was the famous chief of police, Fred Kohler of Cleveland. Although he promised the nominal Cleveland Heights police force assistance, Kohler summarized the problem neatly in a comment to a Cleveland Leader reporter when he said, "Unless there's a tip-off, there's small chance that the crime will ever be traced home." Kohler subsequently removed Cleveland detectives from the investigation, feeling that his men had been snubbed by Cleveland Heights and county sleuths, not to mention the Pinkerton detectives hired by the Rice family and friends. Since they really didn't know what else to do, the authorities did what they always do in such situations. They rounded up the usual suspects. After unsuccessfully third-degreeing one of Rice's Italian servants, they picked on poor Pasquale Giuliano, his former caddy at the Euclid Golf Club, and browbeat him, but he too had an alibi. Early Sunday morning, Cleveland Heights Marshal Lorenzo Brockway and other officers raided some rooming houses of Spence Brothers on Mayfield Road and arrested and interrogated 6 black laborers to no avail. Of course, part of the thinking behind such police procedure was sheer racism, not just simple-mindedness. As one of the newspapers commented guilelessly, Rice's murder had involved the use of a knife, a weapon not normally used, quote, by an average white American, unquote. Or as the Cleveland Leader more bluntly put it in evaluating the third-degree methods given the black and Italian employees at the Euclid Golf Club in the investigation, the clearness of the cut in Mr. Rice's coat sleeve suggested a razor rather than the stiletto of an Italian. By the middle of the following week, a stereo of the Rice killing had spread throughout northeastern Ohio. A clerk at Lane's drugstore on East 55th called police on Tuesday, August 9th, after her suspicions were aroused by a young man's purchase and immediate use of a bottle of peroxide to remove some unidentified stains. Store clerk Alice Puma noted significantly, "I am sure that the young man had clean-cut American features." She was treated as a heroine by the local newspapers. An excited report that some clothes, perhaps murder evidence, had been burned in Little Italy proved only to be some fiery entertainment at the annual Feast of the Assumption Festival. On August 16th, the Plain Dealer reported that the police were seeking an unidentified Italian and Negro who subsequently disappeared from the columns of the newspaper and from history. Illusory fugitives were sought in a boat docked on the lakefront in a fruitless search that sent Cleveland detectives to Detroit and back. The Cleveland Press reported on August 15th that authorities had launched a dragnet in the Geneva-Madison area to apprehend a wounded man who had shown unseemly interest in the Rice case. Another 2 men were sought who had shown a rubbernecking curiosity in the Rice murder that was so intense that they asked a Euclid Heights streetcar conductor to slow down while they looked at the back view of the Rice estate. Even the famous Cleveland detective Jake Mintz was dragged into this unprofessional mess to no avail. No theory of Rice's murder, foolish or otherwise, has been proved to this day. The initial premise, fostered by Patrolman Wall and eagerly embraced, if only temporarily, by Rice's family, was that William Lowe Rice had been the victim of a crude, brutal robbery by footpads, as highwaymen were called in those days, and that Rice had been killed when he resisted them. There were severe difficulties with the hypothesis. William Lowe Rice was killed within several hundred feet of his own home and other well-occupied dwellings near a regular streetcar line on which cars were scheduled every 12 minutes per side. Rice was killed practically directly under an arc street lamp, surely not the preferred locale for furtive footpads. Moreover, the robbers apparently robbed Rice of nothing. Still intact on his body were 3 gold rings, a diamond collar button, gold cufflinks, an impressive bank book, an opal stick pin, and $132.64 in cash. It was rumored that unknown documents of incredible value might have been removed from the body, but no evidence has ever surfaced to support that theory. Other inconsistencies further undermined the robbery paradigm. Although the initial party line of Rice's friends and family was that he didn't have a care or an enemy in the world, other voices soon spoke up. Euclid Golf Club members claimed that Rice had never feared traveling over the lonely roads at night, despite the fact that he had been warned that it might be dangerous. Yet the newspaper soon reported that Rice had received death threats in the weeks before his murder. William Gunther's comment about Rice's seeming reluctance to travel alone was amplified by the revelation at the inquest that Rice had been sleeping for some time with 2 loaded guns beneath his mattress. So the affair wore itself out in a succession of hysterical, inconsistent newspaper headlines. One day it was reported that Rice had traded angry words with an Italian from Little Italy. Another day the headlines blared that one of Rice's business clients had held Rice responsible for his business failure and had actually screamed, "I'll get you for this! I won't say when, but I'll get you!" More recently, crime writer Albert Borowitz has suggested the possibility that William Lowe Rice was assassinated by the relatives of a girl from Little Italy whose honor the vigorous masculine clubman had perhaps indiscreetly wronged. A bizarre wrinkle entered the investigation the day after the murder when a neighborhood boy discovered a bag of dead chickens close to the murder scene. County Detective James Doran theorized that William Lowe Rice had surprised some chicken thieves who had then murdered him to prevent capture. The dead chickens were subsequently traced to the chicken coop of Rice's neighbor, William Palmer, but it still seems improbable that chicken thieves would resort to murder to cover up a theft of that nature. Here's a photograph, actually, of the detectives digging up the Rice estate in a fruitless search for more dead chickens. In the end, in any case, most investigators fall into one of 2 camps. Rice's family and Cleveland Heights officials believed that William Lowe Rice was murdered by a personal enemy or assassins hired by a personal enemy for that purpose. And County Detective James Doran and others clung to another theory that footpad or chicken thieves had killed him. 2 officials who did not believe in either footpads or chicken thieves were Prosecutor John Klein and Assistant Prosecutor Charles Olds, who conducted the inquest during the week after Rice's death. The 100-plus pages of the transcript of their inquiries make chilling reading even after 90 years. From the beginning, they had only one suspect in mind, and most of their lengthy inquest focused on trying to place that suspect at the murder scene. That suspect was Rice's neighbor, former client, and business adversary, John Hartness Brown. About half of the inquest testimony, consisting of the interrogation of numerous streetcar conductors, was spent in what proved to be a vain attempt to destroy John Hartness Brown's alibi for the evening of August the 5th. According to his testimony, he had spent the evening visiting some people down near East 102nd on a business matter and had not arrived back in the Heights until he stepped off that streetcar at Derbyshire and Euclid Heights about 11:20 p.m. It could well have been this streetcar, a 1910 model that was used on the Euclid Heights line. After hours of relentless cross-examination, it ultimately seemed that no conductor on the Heights line could recall seeing John Hartness Brown at all or at any time on the night of the murder. But there were 2 rail employees who remembered him quite vividly from his ride from about 11 p.m. Friday on the East 105th car line that connected the Euclid Heights line. Hartness Brown must have quickly realized that he was the prime suspect in the weekend after the murder because he spent the next few days before the inquest frantically interviewing streetcar conductors as they came off their cars to see if any one of them could remember him from that fateful Friday night. 2 of them eventually did. In the end, prosecutors Old and Klein could not break his alibi, and no public theory of how John Hartness Brown could have perpetrated such a bloody crime without physical evidence showing on his person so soon after was ever offered. The inquest ended in a muttering of inconclusive uncertainty. It is curious, however, that the attendant at Kobler's morgue testified under oath that John Hartness Brown had called there about an hour after the body came in and asked if Mr. Rice's body had been brought in. The attendant maintained adamantly under cross-examination that he had not identified the body to Brown and that it was John Hartness Brown who'd volunteered the information that the dead man was William Lowe Rice. This testimony conflicted with Brown's assertion that he did not know who the victim was in the back of Dr. Phillips' car. But the prosecutors couldn't destroy his alibi, and he remains but an intriguing figure to this day. The late Eric Johansson toyed with the possibility that Brown was the guilty party, consumed as he was assumed to be over the loss of his building to William Rice that very same year. The title of Johansson's article in Timeline said it all: a building worth killing for? I don't think so, and hardly anyone did at the time. But someone did kill William Lowe Rice, and the knowledge we have of his personality and activities suggests a well-thought-out hit. Several remarks by his peers in the wake of his murder suggest that sooner or later, shrewd observers suspected that bad things would begin to happen to William Lowe Rice. Mrs. Rice sobbed to reporters that she couldn't imagine who could do such a thing to a husband who didn't have any enemies. But this doesn't jibe with a comment by Judge W.A. Badcock, who commented just the day after the murder, "The cry of the newsboys that a prominent attorney of Cleveland Heights had been shot led me to say before looking at the paper that it was probably William Lowe Rice." Business partner Jerome Zerby and friend said that Rice was a good businessman, a good lawyer, and as anyone will tell you, a good citizen of Cleveland Heights. But Judge Theodore Strimple said, "It is my opinion that Rice was killed for revenge. He had many wide business interests, and he must inevitably have made many enemies." L.Q. Rawson, an ex-partner of Rice's, said, "I can't imagine anyone having a grudge against William Lowe Rice." But K.G. Martin Foran spoke volumes about the rumors that swirled around William Lowe Rice. After publicly scoffing at the idea that it was a botched robbery attempt, he said, "I have very definite ideas on the subject, but I do not care to say more." The various investigations petered out fitfully, replete with braying bravado on the part of bewildered authorities. County Prosecutor John Klein warned, "The guilty men in this case will be caught. Sooner or later, the murderer will be brought to justice." Rice's law partner Blandon boasted, "We'll get him. Money's no object in this pursuit. Murder will out, and the people who know will come forward and give us the information we want. The man who has that load to carry will give way under the burden." But time went by. A year later, Pinkerton detective F.D. Amau noisily brandished the alleged confession of a certain Vincent Pilato, who claimed that he and two other criminals had been the lethal chicken thieves confronted by the luckless William Lowe Rice. The police did not believe Pilato, nor did they credit the confession of one Wood Finley Brown, who confessed to New Jersey lawmen in 1916 that he had once stuck up a certain Mr. Rice in Cleveland. 5 years later, in 1921, County Prosecutor Edward Stanton expressed hope that he could tie the clique of professional killers involved in the Lakewood Caber case to the Rice killing. His hope was in vain. In the 1950s, lawyers cleaning out the files at Jones Day made a grisly discovery when they opened up a box containing the blood-stained clothing worn by William Lowe Rice on that fateful August evening. Albert Borowitz recounts in his article on the Rice killing that the attorney who found the bloody clothing took it to a couple of senior partners in the firm who had known William Lowe Rice and asked him what they thought. They both said, "Oh yes, everyone knows who did it." Both attorneys then named a different suspect. It is further said that Rice's bloody suit was rent by an incredible number of apparent knife slashes. Although the autopsy report doesn't support this, such wounds would support Borowitz's theory of the murder as a crime passionnel provoked by unknown but spicy incidents in Rice's personal life. This copy of Rice's death certificate, however, mentions only his main gunshot wound as the cause of death. The world that made and unmade William Lowe Rice has faded away. The Euclid Golf Club was torn down several years after Rice's death, and its golf club was carved up into residential lots. This photograph, taken in 1909, shows the damage wrought to it by a bad tornado. Where William Lowe Rice played his last 9 holes on August 5, 1910, today stands the Alcazar Hotel. Lowe Ridge was sold by his widow in 1919 to Fred and Miriam White, who lived in it until the 1940s. It was subsequently razed, although the ruined sunken garden and the remains of the abandoned outbuildings survived for some years, as I can recall exploring the mysterious, overgrown property myself as a child, especially this dilapidated gazebo when I was a child in the late 1950s. This photograph of the third-floor ballroom was taken the year before the home was wrecked. In the late 1950s, the property was finally developed, and where Lowe Ridge stood, towering over the city, now stands the Waldorf Towers apartment building. And to the south, the back part of Rice's property, where he was bound when he was killed, is the Margaret Wagner nursing home. Interestingly, I discovered from reading the inquest testimony that Kenilworth Road once went all the way through to Overlook, more or less bisecting the Rice estate. It seems that when Rice and his wealthy neighbors got tired of the traffic through there, they simply closed off the street to the Cleveland City line and privatized it. This pleasant grove of trees is where that garden grew. Most of the cream of the Overlook mansions has gone the way of Millionaires Row, but you can still find a few magnificent houses occupied chiefly by institutions. Ironically, many of the outbuildings and servant quarters have survived, as in this coach house, and are still admirable housing. Rice's widow Elise spent the years after she left Cleveland in 1919 living on Park Avenue in New York and keeping up with society. In 1923, she was presented to the Queen of England, and she still then retained the handsome looks that had graced the erstwhile chatelaine of Lowe Ridge. She died in 1938 and sleeps by the side of her husband in Lakeview Cemetery. Next to their daughter Elise, who joined them there in 1968. Elise Rice's obituary in the Plain Dealer included this unattributed but tantalizing quote. It read, "A fellow who had a grudge against Rice got some of these professionals to kill him," a prisoner in county jail told authorities shortly after the Rice slaying. "This is only a tip for you to try and get the dope on him some other way. If I am confronted with those fellows, I will deny everything. I would rather lie in jail all my life than let them know that I said a word, for I would be a dead man in no time." John Harkness Brown, like Patrick Calhoun, a fellow founder of Cleveland Heights, lost his investment in it and even his own stately home several years after the Rice killing. He also lost his wife, Catherine, who divorced him on grounds of cruelty in 1914 and died soon after. Brown left after that for England and supposedly, according to the late Nat Howard, the old editor of the Cleveland News, became a respected city planner in England. He is reputed to have remarked when asked in later years about Cleveland Heights, "I don't think I ever want to go back there." Oh, and in case you're wondering what happened to John D. Rockefeller, he didn't serve any jail time for that South Euclid speeding ticket. He simply sent one of his lackeys to pay the $8 fine in his stead. And the murder of William Lowe Rice remains unsolved to this day. Thank you for coming. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
What do you think?
I'm inclined to think, just because I tend to have a romantic penchant, I like to think that it was a crime passionnel. He ruined some girl from Little Italy, and somebody decided to deal with it. My wife is of the opinion that it was chicken thieves. But that seems too prosaic to me. As somebody once told me, when I sent off a copy of my first book to a friend of mine who'd been one of my instructors in college many years before, and he wrote me back to tell me that he enjoyed it and everything else, and that the first story he'd gone to after reading the brief descriptions on the back was the murder of William Lowe Rice, and that was because it was his kind of story. He said, you know, everybody loves it when a rich guy gets it. Yeah, I think that's an awful lot of the appeal of the William Lowe Rice story. It's obviously, I'd say from the content of the slideshow, it's obviously have a great deal of its appeal to me. But also because it recalls a part of Cleveland Heights. I grew up a block away from there, and from the moment that I became aware that there was a murder, it occurred to me that history was something that could happen in the place where you lived, and in your lifetime. That's why I do trolley tours of Cleveland murder and disaster sites now, because it just comes alive for me and I sort of start to relive it while it's happening. It's so much tidier and less messy than the 20th century also. Yes?
Was the body mutilated at all, you know?
No, the death certificate and the autopsy report was fairly straightforward. There was a gunshot wound over the eye. There was a glancing shot from the head. There was there were some wounds around the wrist. He'd apparently tried to fight them off with a penknife, and he'd been bludgeoned on the head, but it really didn't go beyond that. I mean, to a certainty, he had been beaten, stabbed, and shot, but they didn't go in for mutilation for its own sake, and I don't think they could have. It must have happened fairly fast. There was simply too much hopping in the neighborhood that night for people to have lingered to go in for mutilation stuff. Well, one of the most interesting document is the inquest testimony, which I got from the coroner's office. It's 150 pages long, and basically a stenographer was there to take down every word of it. In terms of a social document, it's one of the most interesting Cleveland area documents I've ever come across, because if you want to know what goes on in a house, just ask the servants, and that's exactly what they did. Guess that's about it. I have books for sale if you wish. Yes?
What happened to the daughters?
They all married well. One of them was a friend of somebody who lived up in the Belgian village on Fairhill, and used to come back summers and visit until she died in 1968. So at least one of the daughters kept up her Cleveland contacts, but Mrs. Rice certainly didn't. I talked to somebody who remembered the murder when I was interviewing for this book about 10 years ago. Jeanette Dempsey, who grew up on the Overlook, and who's sister to Philip Johnson, the architect. She was about, I think, 8 years old when it happened. And she told me that all the kids in the neighborhood, of course, that thought that John Hartness Brown had him bumped up because he was having an affair with Rice's wife. And in fact, they even made up a rude nursery skip rope rhyme that they used, and she remembered some of the verses of, but I didn't see fit to put those in my book. But it was a great thrill to meet somebody who actually remembered not only the murder, but also remembered what the social life was like. She remembered the Euclid Golf Club. All the rich families in the neighborhood used to go over there and have Thanksgiving Day to dinner. I mean, for them, they were part of Cleveland 400. It was really just like one big extended social family. Yes?
Where was the garden on Euclid Heights?
Well, the garden was, the lot ran all the way, you know where the wall is there now?
Yeah.
It was just beyond there, and more or less the middle section running more towards Euclid Heights than Overlook. But the lot ran all the way from Overlook to Euclid Heights. It was 700 feet deep, and wider at the Overlook end than at the Euclid Heights end. And you could still see the ruins of it when I was a child. But it was really more along that wall, what we call Kenilworth Lane there now, and was reputed to be one of the most beautiful ones in the United States. Yes?
I grew up on Overlook Road next door to the Rice Mansion, and I spent a lot of times in the gardens in the back, sunken gardens. There's still some Japanese maples there left in the sunken garden, and ironically, spending my whole life on Overlook Road, I had many encounters with Italians that came up the hill, actually, and I've had knives pulled on me, and
I remember the Italians from the hill myself, from my own childhood.
It wasn't unusual for them to come up the hill,
right.
And spending my whole life on Overlook Road, I had many encounters in that regard. So my own guess would be, from my personal experience, that it probably was a couple of Italians that came up the hill and ran back down. Also, it's only 2 or 3 minutes at the maximum to run from that point where he was murdered down the hill. They could be in literally seconds down.
Well, there was some evidence at the time. There was a house being built on the little leg of Kenilworth. Most people call Short Kenilworth. It's the house where Adela Prentice Hughes eventually lived, and there was a family named McGrath over there. It's still there. It's the second house from the corner. I think it's 2400 Kenilworth. It was just being in the progress of being built there, and they found some evidence there a couple of days later that whoever committed the murder had hid out there for at least several minutes because they had disturbed some of the construction work there. They think that's where they hid while the search was going on in the immediate neighborhood, but there again, there's no way of proving it. Yes?
Well, the part that gets me is because they didn't take anything. I mean, not even one thing. If you're going to rob somebody and kill them, it just... Okay, just curious.
Well, they had... The maids had testified that he had arguments with some of the...
He had arguments with everybody.
On the hill,
yeah.
And everybody agrees that it was a revenge motive.
But it was one of those things like
They
Like-
were angry.
It was one of those scenarios like Murder on the Orient Express. Almost everybody who knew him had a reason for killing him. And that's really what the inquest testimony was about. It was hard to find somebody who didn't have some kind of motive, petty or otherwise, for being angry at William Lowe Rice. He was a man who was used to getting his own way and wasn't shy about it. Yes.
It sounds like, you know, first you said that some people said that he never walked home alone. Others said that he wasn't
Right.
worried about it. You said there were two different paths that he might have taken.
Right.
So you would think that if someone was hiding in wait, okay, they would have just had to stay there night after night hoping that they would catch him by himself going that particular route. Or would it have been someone who was following him? Because if he didn't have a set routine, and unless he went home every night by himself at that time on that path, there's no way that they would have known that he was going to do it that night.
We still don't know. Anybody else? Thanks for coming.